Hello everyone, welcome to another video in this full stack Flutter development series. In this video, we'll be looking at tying everything together. So far we have done our auth module and our restaurant module, both back-end and from our Flutter app. And now we want to tie everything together to ensure that they are working seamlessly. So in this video, I'll be doing a couple of refactorings and getting the app to work as a whole rather than just testing out single modules in and of themselves. So we'll dive right into it and we'll start in our composition root. As you can see by now that the composition root takes care of all our object construction so that all of our screens and those dependencies are in one place. Now, I am not using the service locator here in this video, and so that is why I have all my object construction in one place, which is good. So now, inside of my main, I am only composing the home UI, which is displayed now in our simulator. So what I want to do is, instead of displaying the home UI, I want to go inside. Inside my composition root, I want to create a method that will, on startup, this method will determine whether to show the home UI or whether to show the authentication, the login screen. So I'm just going to create another static method which will return a widget, a future widget, and you'll soon see why this is a future. And I'm just going to call it start. And so in this method, I want to first of all get my token from the token store. So our local store here, and I want to say fetch, which in this case will fetch the token. And as you can see, because my local store is asynchronous and I have to use the await, that is why I have to use a future here on this static method. So now after I fetch my token, then I'll determine which screen to show depending on the token. So where the token is null, so if the token is null, then what I want to do is show the auth UI. So I'm just gonna say compose auth UI, otherwise compose the home UI. And that's it. So now inside of our main, instead of showing the home UI here, we will call our start to show here. But because our start is a asynchronous method, we cannot say start here, else Flutter is gonna scream, right? We need a future widget. So what we're going to do is, inside of our main, we can actually make our main async, and then after we have composed or configure rather the main global dependencies, then we can say, all right, the screen to show, I'm just going to call the variable screen to show, is equal to await, then our composition root, and we call the start method. And then we pass that screen to show here inside of our app. So screen to show. Then we'll make that available here as a widget. So final widget, and I'm gonna call it start page. Then inside of the constructor, I'll say start page. So now here we'll show start page instead. Now this should cause some concern, some error. Side of our widget test here, we can just get rid of that since we are not doing any widget testing. But now you can see that we have null here. Let's just refresh and see what happens. So after restarting, now I am getting this error which says that the cache string is not present, and what is happening here is that the shared preference is not initialized properly. So if we go back to our composition root, where we see we have local store here with shared preference, but we need to initialize shared preference by getting the instance. So it should be shared preferences await shared preferences get the instance. Now again, we have to make this async since we now have async method being involved. So now our shared preference should be okay. Now if we go back here again, where we have our configure method inside main, we need to make it that this awaits also. So now we have that. If we go ahead again, restart, now we have a different issue which has to do with the service binding, and this is because we are calling async method inside of our main, which means that we have method waiting while the thread to build the widget is already executed. So for that, Flutter has a ensure initialized method that we use when calling async methods inside of our main. And for that, we simply add it to the top or the first line inside of our main, which is the widget Flutter binding, and we say ensure initialized. So that should take care of that. So if we go ahead and restart again, then we should see we have lost connection. So let me run the app again. And now we have our auth page showing. Since the token is null, we have not been authenticated, therefore there's no token inside of our local store. So that is good. Now inside of our auth page, we want to go ahead and make some modifications. As you can see that where if you use your keyboard or your soft keyboard here, you'll realize that the screen is not resizing properly. Let me get that up and show you. So as you can see here, there is some issue with the padding at the bottom when the keyboard is shown. So to resolve that, we'll need to go inside of our auth page and we need to allow our UI here to be scrollable. So we need to allow the text fields and the food space logo to be scrollable, so that when the keyboard comes up, then it automatically, the UI scrolls to the top to support the keyboard. And how we go ahead and do that is to basically wrap our main content inside of a scroll view, or a single scrollable view. I don't quite remember the name of the widgets, but you will see. So where we have our column, we're gonna go ahead and wrap that inside of a single child scroll view. Now we have that. Then now that will cause some issue. If you should look inside, we have issue errors where resizing or laying out the screen is concerned, and that is because our main UI, which is this, is a page view with an expanded, where the space cannot be calculated. So what I'll do is to change this from expanded to a container, and I'm going to give this container a height of 500. Let us restart. So there we have it. So now if we have the soft keyboard, we're no longer getting that issue. Here we go. Also, for our text fields, we would like for this to be an email field and this to be password field. As you can see now, the password is not hidden. So, and also for our keyboard, we would like to determine the action that is shown here. So instead of done, we would like to see next, so you can move to the next text field. So to accomplish that, we'll go ahead and inside of our custom text field here, I'm gonna add 3 more variables. So I'm just gonna add the text input action, the keyboard type, and obscure to obscure the password. So now inside of our text field here, I'm just gonna say obscure text, use the obscure variable that is passed in or false. So if the variable is not available, then false. For the keyboard type, I'm gonna use the keyboard type that we passed in, or I'm just gonna use the default text input type text. So now if we go back to our auth page, for our email, we want to say, okay, keyboard text input type email address, and for our input action, next. For the password, no, we want the obscure to be true, and we want the input action to be done. That's for email and password. Then inside of our sign up, where we have a username, we want the username to have a input action. And we want this action to be next. So now you can see my password is obscure. There's a next button being displayed here, so I can move to the next text field. When I'm done, I can go ahead and sign in. With sign up, we have our username. Then we have next, we can move to the next field, which is an email field. Then we move to the next field, which is a password field. And then we can go ahead and sign up. So now we have our auth page behaving as it should. So now we have to go ahead and for our auth page to create that or adapter. And you have seen me using the adapters, and you might wonder, why do I use adapters? And the purpose of using these adapters is so that I might abstract away the object construction of the other screen from the current screen that I'm on. So instead of having all the parameters needed for the next screen inside of this particular screen, for example, inside of auth page here, instead of, when I click this sign up button, instead of trying to create all the dependency that needs to be passed over to the home screen or the restaurant screen inside of the pressed method here, then I'll simply use the adapter as a middleman. So that you would call the adapter method here, and then the adapter method will execute the appropriate composition function from the composition root, and that will create all the dependencies for the particular screen that I want to go. So let us go ahead and create that, and you will see it in action. So I've gone ahead and created my auth page adapter. And first I create a abstract interface class, contract, whatever you choose to call it in the Flutter context, because we have no interface here, so we have to use an abstract class. And it has one method which is on success, or on the person being authenticated successfully. We want to pass in the build context, and we want to pass in the service that the person used to authenticate, whether it was through email or through Google. And we want to pass that to the home screen so that when the person logs out, since the log out button will be on the home screen, it uses the appropriate auth service to log out. So now, inside of the adapter, we have a function on user authenticated, and this function will accept the auth service. And then we will, on user authenticated, when there's success, we basically tell the navigator to say, okay, remove that screen and create a new material route with the widget that is returned from this on user authenticated method. And in this case, the widget will be the home screen UI, and we'll pass that auth service onto the home screen UI. And we use push and remove until, because we do not want the user to have the ability to go back to this authenticated screen after they have been authenticated. So that is the purpose of this method. And so inside of our auth page, whenever the person is authenticated, we are going to go ahead and call this method. So now here, inside of our Qubit consumer, we are going to check if we receive a authenticated success state. So if auth success state, then I'll go ahead, widget adapter. I've not yet passed in the adapter, but we'll call the adapter here, and we'll say on auth success. Then we'll pass in the context and the service that the user authenticated with. This adapter is not yet present, so we have to go inside of our composition root and pass in that adapter. So we have auth page adapter here. Then we say this adapter, and we pass in that adapter. Now inside of our composition root, we need to configure that adapter here. So I'm gonna say auth page adapter then on user authenticated, I'm gonna say compose home UI. And then inside of my home UI, which needs to accept a auth service, then we'll pass in the adapter here. There we have. So we have an error here. So we have another set of refactoring to do so that this can work properly. We have errors inside of our auth page here also. So I'm just gonna say auth service, and this service will be instantiated based on the type of service the user used to log in. And in order to get that working properly, I'll have to refactor my manager inside of my auth module. So I'm going to open up the manager here, and I'm going to refactor the manager. So I've gone ahead and done the refactoring of the manager, which is pretty simple. All I did was to create a single service method which returns an instance of the appropriate service based on the type requested. So you pass in a auth type, and then it will say if this type is Google, then instantiate a Google service and pass that to the consumer client. If it's an email service, then pass that or bring that on, instantiate that and pass that back to the client or the requester of the service. I also want to, inside here, export adapters email auth. So now back to our auth page where we have our onPress methods, where we have onPress. I am going to say service is equal to widget manager service, and I'm going to say give me auth type, give me an email service. Now auth type is not available here, and I think we have to export auth type here. So now we have our auth type available. So now give me an email service. Then what I want to do is to cast that service to email so that I can access the credentials, since what is returned is the base class type, which is iAuth service. So now cast that as an email auth, then access the credentials, and there will set up the credentials. So email and password. Now casting here is a bit weird. This is not the best way to approach this. I think it can be done differently, so that we do not have to cast. Maybe creating the email service or factory different from the Google service, but for now I'm just casting it. And then I'm gonna say sign in, and I'm gonna pass in the service and also the auth type. So that I can store the auth type locally, so that when the person logs out, or when the person closes the app, rather, not logs out, but closes the app and start it up again, I can fetch the type that they authenticated with, so that if in case they choose to log out, I now can log out with the appropriate type. So I'm gonna do a similar thing here for Google. Manage a service, Google service, then auth type Google. Now our qubit doesn't, the sign-in method on our qubit doesn't accept an auth type, so we'll have to modify that here to accept that auth type. Then we'll use the local store to store the type. And in order to do that, we will have to create inside of our local store 2 new methods. One for the, we have one to fetch the token. No, we need one to store the type and fetch the type. So I'm just gonna say here after login, I'm just gonna say local store, and I'm gonna say save auth type. But I'm gonna create that method and pass in the type. So now I need to go to my cache, find my local store, and I'm going to add 2 new methods to my local store. The fetch auth and the save auth type. Then I'll open my actual local store implementation. So I've created these 2 methods for my auth type, for fetching my auth type from the local store and saving my auth type to the local store. So it's pretty simple or pretty familiar to the token implementation, which is I have created this string cached auth, and I'm saying shared preferences, give me that string. If a string is not null, then future set the value to auth type values, and I'm basically looping through the values of the auth type here and say first where the value is actually what is returned from the string. So if the string is auth.google, then it will fetch that auth type and return it. And save auth type is pretty straightforward also. I'm saving it as a string. So now we have created those methods, then our auth qubit should be okay, so that when we logs in or sign in, then we'll save the auth type in our local store so we can use it for our further purposes. Now back to our composition root here inside of our home UI. This is where when we start up, we're gonna again look in the local store if there's an auth type, and then pass that auth type to our home UI. So we have gone ahead inside of the start method. We have simply asked the local store to give us the auth type, and then we have asked the manager to say give us an instance of this auth type that we fetched from the local store, and then we pass that on to the home UI. But as you can see, the manager is screaming out here, and that is because we have it as local to the auth UI or to the compose auth UI function. So we need to move this outside to make it accessible. So we have our static manager, and then here we'll say manager equal manager, and we need to pass in here our auth API. So again, move the auth API here, make it accessible here, set up our auth API, then we pass it here in our service. We can go ahead and remove this manager here. So now we have our service coming from the local store and pass to our compose UI, compose home UI rather. Now for our home UI, we want the ability to log out also. So we need to include that here. So to accomplish that, we need our auth qubit to be a part of our home page. So we have our auth qubit, and we'll go ahead and add it as part of our multi-block provider or qubit provider here in this case. And then inside of our restaurant page here, we need to go ahead and pass in the service also, which is the auth service. And then inside of our adapter, we need to tell the adapter that on logout, you need to go ahead and compose the auth UI. So inside of our homepage adapter, we need to add that method. So go inside of our homepage adapter. So inside of our homepage adapter, I've gone ahead and I've added that method for when the user logs out. So we have user logout, and then we have the onLogout function that we pass into the constructor here. And then for the onUserLogout, we basically do the same thing as the auth screen, which is to push and remove until, and the material row will build the widget that is returned by this method, and this method will in turn build all the dependencies needed for that screen. So we have our adapter, homepage adapter setup. Then we have here So now inside of our restaurant list page, we need to go ahead and accept that auth service. And we have both our services up and running. So I am going to try and log in with a user that I have in my database. So my backend is up and running right now. If I should show you guys that, if I should say npm run dev inside of my backend to kickstart my backend, so that is running. Now, if I try to log in with a user that I have in my database, so I am not logging in. Let me check my backend to see if everything is up and running. So I've gone ahead and logged in. Not sure what happened, but it seems as if my backend was not responding at the time. Everything is working as it should now. So now I'm showing my restaurant list page. So now here I want to go ahead and set up a logout button so that you can log out at any time. So let us go ahead inside of our actions. I am just gonna create a leading widget. This leading widget is an icon button, and I'm just using the power settings as that icon. So inside it on press, I want a logout method, and I'm just gonna scroll to the bottom here to create that logout method. So here is my logout method, which basically asks the provider to give them the auth qubit and simply call the sign out method passing in the auth service. I am going to go ahead also and create two other methods that will be used by the auth qubit to show a loader when the person logs out and before it redirects to the auth screen. So here are those two methods: show loader, which basically is an alert dialog with a progress indicator, and then I use the show dialog function to show that alert dialog, and then I have the hide loader, which basically removes the dialog from the navigator in the current context. So now I have that. All I need to do now is to set up this loader by using a block listener inside of my stack here at the bottom of my stack right here. I need to use a block listener to listen for the logout, show the loader, and then redirects when the logout is completed. So here I've gone ahead and added the qubit listener inside of our stack. So it's basically an align widget that has a qubit listener that has the auth qubit and the auth state. And you might be wondering why I have auth state dot auth state here, and that is because there was some naming collision, since I have error state both inside of the auth state and inside of the restaurant state. So to clarify that, I have to use some form of alias here for the auth state. So now where I use the auth state, in order to access those classes, I have to use that namespace first. So now by using that namespace, I have access to all those classes. So I have the loading state and I have the sign out success state. In this case, I say call the onUser logout method from the adapter and pass in the context. Where there's an error state, I basically show a snap bar, and then after all this, I hide the loaded. No matter what state, I always hide the loader. But this is what redirects to the log in or the sign up page or the auth page. So now if I should say log out, then it should load and redirect me to that screen. So now I am logged out and back to the sign in screen. So let me go ahead and sign in again. So an issue happened where I logged out, but the screen keeps on loading without redirecting. And that was because inside of my auth qubit, inside of the set result of the auth state, I was not, as you can see, I am not saving the token to the local store. So it has issue since it cannot find any token. So I'll go ahead, save the token to the local store. So now if I log out, then you will see that it keeps loading with no end, and that was as a result of that. So if I refresh, then it should start from the login screen. And let me sign in again. Now I'm signed in. The token is stored in the local store. So now if I go ahead and log out, then it should redirect to the auth screen. So go ahead, log out. I have a breakpoint here, clear that. There we go, right back to the auth screen. So we have our authentication set up, and now we can log into our screens. But the next thing we'll have is to fetch the restaurants from our restaurant API instead of using the fake restaurant that we have now. And to do that, I am going to create another folder here called decorators. And what is a decorator, you might ask? A decorator is simply a programming pattern that allows you to add behavior to an object without actually modifying the class. So I want to create a secure client in this decorator, a secure API client that uses the token to call the restaurant APIs. I cannot use the same API as the auth API because that one doesn't require tokens to access secret resource. So this API client is what I call a secure API client. So inside my decorator, I'll create my secure client. And decorators, you normally use decorators for cross-cutting concern, things like logging or network policy or network retry policy, those kind of things. So here's my secure client decorator implementation. And how it works is that you basically implement the same interface as the HTTP client that you're going to use. That is the unsecured one. Then what happens is that you will pass in the unsecure client in the constructor, and in this case I'm using the local store also to fetch the token. And then inside of the get method, since there are only two methods for HTTP client, that is get and post, we are going to say fetch the token. Then we are going to add the token to the authorization header. Then we call the actual get method from the client. So this is where we are wrapping this existing object. Now we are adding additional functionality to it by wrapping this object inside this function and doing a bunch of stuff before we call the actual call on that object. You can read up more about the decorator pattern. It's easily found on Google if you search it up, or you can check out one of my videos that I have describing the decorator pattern more clearly. So now we have our secure client set up, both get and post method. We want to use our secure client inside of our composition root when we are setting up our restaurant page instead of the regular client. So now let us set up our secure client. Then instead of our fake restaurant API, we're going to use our actual restaurant API. Which we need to import from our restaurant module or export. So inside of our restaurant .dart file in our restaurant module, we go ahead and say export API restaurant API, and then we'll have our restaurant API here. Instead of fake restaurant API, we are going to say give me the actual restaurant API, which accepts as its parameter the base URL and the client. So now I'm going to create my secure client. I'm going to say secure client, and it needs a HTTP client. So I'm going to say my HTTP client that I have or should have exported from commons. So if I go back to commons, here is my HTTP client, which I call HTTP client IMPL. So it is exported. So if I say HTTP client IMPL, then I'm going to pass in the client there, which is the actual client from the HTTP package. And the reason why I'm not finding my HTTP client is because I need to go ahead in my PubSpec YAML, as I've done and I need to import the common library as I've done the restaurant and auth. So here you have the common and you set the path. Now I'll have access to those and I can import it. And there's my HTTP client and also the local store. Now inside my restaurant API, there I'll pass in that base URL and also that secure client as my restaurant API. There we have it configured for our homepage so that we can fetch restaurants from our backend instead of using the fix. But before this can work, I need to go back to my restaurant module. Inside my restaurant API, I must make a few changes to these endpoints so that they match the endpoints that works with my backend. For example, this query, this term should be changed to query, and this should be changed to a query object. Restaurant, it should be restaurant then ID. Then for the menu, for the location, it should be restaurants location, then the question sign. And then for the menu, it should be restaurants, then restaurant/menu restaurant ID. I also need to go ahead and make a slight change to the mapper here. So this display image URL here should be display image URL that is coming back from the JSON, and also inside of the menu here should be image URLs. Then this should be unit price. So these changes are based on what the backend is sending to us. So now that we have that inside of our composition root, everything looks nice. We should go ahead and try to log in and see what's happening. So now I'm logged in with my restaurants coming from my back end. So inside of my restaurant list page, if I can find that quickly, or my home page, restaurant list page, there is a, for the header, when we build the header, we want to fetch the image that, now we're using a stock image right here, but we want to use the actual image URL. So we just go ahead and say header image URL. If we refresh to see if it is fetching that image URL, And now we see we are getting that image URL from the database, even though an error is thrown for the first load because it's empty. That's something we can fix, but it's not going to cause any crashing right now. So if I click on one of the restaurants, then I need to rectify also that this is coming from the database. So we'll go to our restaurant page. Inside of our restaurant page, we'll change here to give us the restaurant that we're passing in. So restaurant. Need the display image URL there. And now we need to get those list of menus to display, which is we build a menu here. Seem to not let me try another restaurant to see. So we are not fetching the menus. So we need to find out why that's the case. So now I have my restaurant fetching the menus. So the issue was that inside of my restaurant API in the get restaurant menu function, I had misspelled the restaurants here. Also inside of the mapper, you need to go ahead and cast the unit price to double, or else it's gonna throw an error about int, casting an int. And then for the search, find restaurants here, the actual URL is restaurants search with the question mark, so that those are the search queries. So now if I go back and say search for Glover, then I find Glover. If I click on a restaurant, then I should get all those menus. As you can see, there are some fields that I have not changed or updated. You can go ahead in your code and change them. For example, the rating. I am still using a hard-coded value here instead of getting the rating from the backend. Go ahead, get your rating. Go ahead, get those tags or restaurant types so you can know what type of the restaurant it is and update these also. But for now, everything is working as it should, and I will stop here. As you can see, the image is also changing in the header based on the restaurant that is at the top, the particular category of restaurant. So if I go ahead and sign out now, if I should try sign in with Google, it says fail to sign in with Google. And I believe this has to do with me setting up my Google client ID. So if you have that issue, please make sure your app is registered in Firebase or in Google. You get that client ID and everything is configured properly. So that's it for now, guys. We have put our restaurant app together. All the pieces are working as it should, with the exception of that Google sign in, which is simply me just registering the app and get it working. So thank you for tuning into this one, and I believe this might be the last video in this series. I'm gonna move on to something else, something more beginner friendly. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope that you have benefit and learn a lot from this. Please share this with somebody else, like, subscribe, and remember the code is on GitHub. So see you guys in the